Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Venable and our program today entitled The 2016 Election, What Does It Mean for Nonprofit Federal Grantees? My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, Chair of the Nonprofit Organizations Practice at the Venable Law Firm. This program is part of the monthly series of programs that we've been doing for over 6 years now on a wide variety of different nonprofit legal topics, but this one is a bonus program, the second one of the month, at the tail end of the month, because obviously there is some very important timing here, important tips, suggestions, steps that we thought it was going to be very important to pass on to the nonprofit federal grantee community as a result of the election and the pending change in the administration that's going to come in January. In our government grants and contracts group, part of our nonprofit practice, as we were talking through these issues, realizing there was a lot of things that nonprofit federal grantees may want to do and can do in the short term before the Trump administration takes over in January. And so we scheduled today's program so that you'll have the benefit of all of that insight and wisdom and practical suggestions here today. A few housekeeping things first. For those of you from the Trade and Professional Association community, these programs are eligible for CAE, Continuing Education Credit. Here's a preview of our scheduled upcoming programs. December 12th, we have a program entitled Top 10 Risks Facing Nonprofits Operating Internationally. That's also being co-sponsored by the BDO firm. And on January 12th, our topic is entitled Top 10 Hot Button Insurance Issues Facing Nonprofits. We do have programs already scheduled for February and March, and we'll be announcing those very shortly. For those of you in the room, you have a handout book that has a copy of the PowerPoint slides of today's presentation, along with some ancillary handout materials, some articles from our group on related topics, as well as full speaker bios. Those of you on the webinar, we have close to 200 of you that joined us across the country today. Welcome to all of you as well. You received in the confirmation email that went to you, was delivered today. There's a link to this PowerPoint slides, and all of you tomorrow will receive a recording of today's program in an email along with all of the handout materials and PowerPoint slides. For those of you in the room, ask your questions at any time. Just raise your hand and just wait for the microphone to come to you so everyone on the webinar can hear you. And those of you on the webinar, please pose your questions to me using the chat feature on the webinar software. We have a special announcement today that I want to ask Melanie to come up, and Melanie Totman, my colleague, one of our speakers today, to talk to you about.
Good afternoon. I don't know, for those of you in the room, if you have found this little card, you can pull it out and take a look at it. It's called the Government Grants Resource Library Card. So for about 6 months, I've been talking to Jeff and Diz and some of our other people. Camille King has been instrumental in this process, about a need that I saw when the uniform guidance took shape. Basically, I kept having to Google old regs. I don't know if any of you have had this problem where you're like, my old grants and cooperative agreement is governed by old regulation, or it's governed by, I remember there was a guidance put out somewhere by some agency at some point in time I think might be relevant, and you're just constantly Googling, right? Like you're like, where is this thing? Because now everything's changed. Wow, Westlaw's expensive. It's not always timely and accurate in updates. And so what we decided to do is we were going to create our own resource library. This is free. You can visit it at www.grantslibrary.com. It has all of the old regulations, important resources, memos, guidance put out by different agencies. It has by category every single article we've ever written in our grants and government contracts newsletter. If you've gotten those monthly, and if you're not on the list, please let us know. We'll sign you up. And they're categorized by topic. So if you go to the website and you want to learn more about cost issues, or you want to learn about the False Claims Act, or you want to learn about ethics obligations, you can just click on the button, sort of like you're pulling out a book in the library, and you can see every single resource, every single newsletter we've ever published on that by topic, by category. This is meant to really be a living resource. We're hoping that our community of 700 nonprofit clients will contribute to it in the sense that if there's a resource on there that you don't see, if there's something in there that you think should be included in the additional resource tab or memorialized, please let us know, and we'll be happy to consider whether to add it. So please go use this all the time if you want, totally free. It's called www.grantslibrary.com, and check it out and let us know what you think about it.
Thank you, Melanie, and thank you especially for all of your tireless efforts. This is Melanie's brainchild, and we're really proud of it and happy to be launching it today. And in Melanie's honor and at her suggestion, for those of you in the DC office here today, stick around afterward. We have some champagne in the back of the room and some snacks for a little reception to help celebrate the launch party here today. Our speakers, first, this is the first time that she is speaking on one of our programs, and probably because she's only been with us for about 2.5 months. My colleague, CRA Ward. CRA is a member of Venable's Legislative and Government Affairs Group. She focuses on financial services and the housing finance market. She has experience with issues relating to housing finance reform, insurance, consumer financial services, payment systems, and community economic development. Prior to entering private practice, CRA was an attorney with the U.S. Department of the Treasury during the economic crisis and focused on, among other topics, the creation of a federal insurance office, the Financial Stability Oversight Council, funding for small business development, and other federal grant programs. CRA has a lot of experience in this area from the federal agency side and has spent her whole career focused on issues like this. She's going to bring a terrific perspective to today's program. Following CRA, my colleague on my far right, Diz Licari, is a partner in the firm's government grants and contracts practice. Diz is an instrumental member. Diz and Melanie really are two rock-solid members of the government grants and contracts group that work extensively with many of our nonprofit clients each year on lots of different legal and regulatory issues in this space. They're also the principal authors of the monthly newsletter that we put out on federal grant and contract issues for nonprofits. And Diz is a terrific colleague of mine. And then finally, Melanie Totman, who you just heard from, who is an attorney also in the government contracts group and another key member of the team. You can see their full bios in the handout materials. But without any further ado, let's turn it over to Kara to get us started. Kara.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be with you guys today. And I just want to make sure I have the clicker. Oh, sure. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be working on, or what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I'll kick things off by setting the place where we are post-election, what's going on, who are the new faces, and what do we think that we're going to hear the most about in the first 100 days or first 2 quarters. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about what can you expect administratively from your agencies and from your program officers. And then next is what impact or what might you need to brace yourselves for in the event that there's change. But with that, let's just move on to the next slide. So this is an important slide just to table set here, because the next president is going to have to deal with the debt. So right now, spending outstrips revenues by about $500 billion. So what we're looking at here is revenues are about $3.2 trillion, and most of that's coming from taxes, as you can well expect. Not too much of that's coming from the $10 parking fee at the National Park Service. But when you get into spending, what you're looking at here is mandatory spending right now is at about $2.3 trillion, and discretionary spending is at $1.2 trillion. And just for some of us in the room who don't do this every day, mandatory spending is things like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That funding is set by statute, and it would stay stable throughout any kind of budget cycle unless there's large legislation to change those formulas for how much money is allocated to them. Discretionary spending is kind of reallocated each year. Digging into discretionary spending, this is where a lot of the grants funds will be coming from in the next Congress. And you'll see that it's a pretty even split between defense and non-defense spending. You'll see that they're matching each other by about $1 billion. And you'll see here, when you look at the non-defense spending, if you're able to look at the small numbers that are up on the screen or in front of you, The other category is probably where I would say the largest concentration of grants and cooperative agreements live. So that's going to be housing programs, so that's a lot of HUD funding, and community and regional development, which is a catch-all for a lot of things that are in different agencies. So what are we taking away from these charts? At the highest level, you're going to need more money to cover the projected growth in mandatory spending. And when we say mandatory spending, again, what we're talking about is Social Security costs and Medicare and Medicaid are increasing, especially as the baby boomers ripen into Social Security age and basically age into more expensive medical care costs. So you're going to need more money to cover that growth in the spending, but that also means not just new revenues, which are new taxes, but you're probably also going to need to do cuts. And when we look at the first things on the next administration's agenda, we're hearing a lot about tax reform. So if you're thinking about what tax reform could mean for you all, there's a number of personal and business taxes, but what it's talking about is how big that pie will be that I showed a little bit earlier for the next go-around. Spending cuts. This is where the discretionary spending is probably most likely to feel the impact of the next administration's budget concerns. Already we've heard President-elect Trump talk a little bit about what he would do. He'd institute a government hiring freeze, so that would probably limit that would result in significant cost savings in some areas of the government. But otherwise, he talked a little bit about defunding certain programs at the U.S. Department of Education. He says he wants to repeal Common Core, and then perhaps doing away with the EPA in its entirety. So while when I was thinking about this presentation about a month ago, I had a different slide here to talking about like what the spending priorities would be. What's interesting is it's anyone's guess right now, but the word to the wise is to think about your program and how it's fitting into the current narrative of the way that the Trump administration could be viewing. All right. We're going to be seeing some new faces. Key cabinet secretaries will be coming online here shortly. So here's some that have already been made public and some that we're projecting. What's interesting here is when you look at education, HUD, energy, and treasury, they're going to be led by relatively newbies to government service who are right now landing with their briefing books and perhaps learning about your programs for the very first time. The overall trend that we're looking at when we look at these cabinet secretaries that are already announced or projected is that it's trending more conservative than they have been now, and even more conservative than perhaps the mainline Republican Party has been in the past. And what that conservative streak will do is steer more towards private sources of funding to accomplish social goals and social needs, and probably a little bit less oversight and regulation for heavily regulated industries. But when it comes to the grant world, I think you're going to see a finer tooth comb going through that particular expenditure, and maybe more aggressive IGs. Let's see. Going down to the regulators, I thought it might be worthwhile noting here that unlike cabinet secretaries, a lot of regulators will be able to serve out their terms at their desire. So we heard from the FDIC that Marty Gruenberg intends to serve out his term, but we've already heard from maybe the SEC that Mary Jo White intends to step down at the end of the year. You'll start to see those announcements flow through over the next month and a half or so, but I think what you'll notice is that different laws will kind of govern who will be acting on an interim basis and whether or not there'll be enough members of the particular regulatory agency to have a quorum for action. You're kind of watching that with the Ex-Im Bank right now where they don't have a quorum. But if you are concerned about a particular agency or a particular regulator's plan of action for what happens in a transition, or if seats become vacant, the Federal Vacancy Act generally controls, and any of us up here on the dais would be glad to chat with you more about that. So when we think about new priorities, there was a banner up on the Trump administration's transition website that said, now hiring 4,000 people. It's since gone away, and I wish I had gotten a screen grab of that before it went, but this is from the New York Times. There are 4,000 new positions that are going to be needed to be filled in the next administration. Now, not everyone leaves on January 20th or January 21st, but the takeaway is that it takes a lot of time to fill 4,000 positions. And wave 1 is happening now with your cabinet secretaries. Wave 2 are going to be your assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries. But it's probably conservatively thinking that these agencies won't be up and running until about August, with even maybe half or a third of the appointees who need to get into their new positions. So immediate wholesale change is unlikely to happen in January when it comes to you thinking about your program, but we can get to in a few minutes what may actually change in January, and Melanie will take us through that. So Congress also had a couple of turnovers and some changes. Now, elections are being held this week and next week for the new committee chairs in both the House and the Senate. So these are unofficial projections. These aren't the Bible yet, but you're going to be seeing some new faces in these committees of jurisdiction, most importantly appropriations and the budget. So this is where, here in the appropriations, this is where the discretionary dollars are going to get doled out. There's some new faces, particularly with the House Republicans, with Mr. Ferlingeiser. Sorry, I cannot say this gentleman's name any day of the week. But we've got a new face there, and then probably very likely new faces on both of the committees, both of the chair and ranking for the Senate here. So just remember that this is anticipated, not confirmed yet, but this is how I think this might shake out. When we get to the budget, now this is where things get kind of interesting. So while the appropriators are taking the bottom line numbers and really like digging into, $6 million for this program, $4 billion for that program, the budget committee is setting the top line numbers, and they're setting the aggregate spending levels. And there's going to be some new faces here where we just saw, Tom Price is vacating his seat in the House to become HHS Secretary. And in the Senate, we could see Mr. Sanders or Senator Sanders take a leadership position that he hasn't had on that committee in some time. What's interesting about the Budget Committee right now is if you were a nerd in legislative process like I am, this committee is the place, particularly in the Senate, where legislation could start moving that isn't subject to what's known as what we call it reconciliation, but it's not going to be subject to the filibuster. So legislation has the opportunity to move through this committee a little bit faster than other pieces of legislation. So what it becomes is a little bit of, in our industry, we call it a Christmas tree. If you can anticipate a budget impact over a 10-year horizon, whether it makes money for the government or costs the government something, it could end up in a budget committee bill that's subject to reconciliation, which only needs 52 votes to pass, as opposed to the typical piece of legislation which would need 60 votes to bring an end to debate, they call it cloture, which is subject to filibuster, and then a majority. So the Budget Committee is the one to watch. These guys are going to be in significant places of power, and they're going to have the power of the purse to set that above line number. Let's talk about what you can expect coming up. Key dates. So one of these dates has already passed here, which is May 30th and 31st. This is CRA, which stands for not Community Reinvestment Act in this context, but it stands for the Congressional Review Act. You're going to be hearing more about this if you haven't already, which is if the Obama administration has finalized a rule or regulation by about May 30th or May 31st that has a significant economic impact, it is ripe for repeal by Congress in its first 60 days of the 115th Congress. So if you are subject to any regulations that were just published this summer, there's the possibility that Congress could repeal that regulation by simple vote between now and March. Or I'm sorry, between January 3rd, which is the anticipated date of the next session of Congress beginning, and 60 days after that, which falls somewhere, legislative days fall somewhere in March, depending on the Easter holiday.
And Kara, just to clarify, you were talking about regs that were finalized after that date, after the May date.
Did I say before?
I think so.
I'm sorry about that. So it's regs that were finalized this summer up till January 20th. The next date that's going to matter is December 9th, and that's when funding for the government right now runs out. We're not going to probably be in a crisis where the government's going to shut down. It looks like they'll do a continuing resolution. First anticipated that it would go until about until about March. Now they think they want to buy themselves more time and go till May. There's probably going to be legislation, if not this time in the CR, in the continuing resolution, but there might be legislation moving when you think about government spending for the debt ceiling, which we're going to hit at some point in March. And then that last date you're seeing there in March 2017, that's the date by which 60 days after the next Congress comes into session, that the ability to repeal rules that were enacted over the summer or at the end of the Obama administration could be repealed. Talking a little bit about the federal budget process. So in ordinary times, the President submits his budget to Congress by mid-February. So the Trump administration may delay that by a couple of weeks or months, which is very common in the federal budget process. But ideally, the way that things would go is that very shortly after taking office, the Trump administration will be talking to his cabinet secretaries about what their budgets will be. This is a particularly sensitive time as they do a review on, the current spending and hopefully increases for certain programs or decreases for other programs. So that happens very quickly. End of March is that submission to Congress. Once it gets into Congress, there's usually a couple of hearings in the committees of jurisdiction who go through that President's request and will submit recommendations to the Budget Committee on what funding levels should be included, and that's when you're going to see those big program fights. And typically it plays out, for some of you guys who haven't watched this before, the Cabinet Secretary will testify before Congress to defend the budget that they may or may not have had substantial amounts of time to spend with it before showing up in March, April, and May for these hearings. It's interesting. Watch it carefully because your program might get discussed. So this is some of the thinking right now on what President-elect Trump anticipates being able to accomplish in his first 100 days. The graphic here is a little bit small, so hopefully you guys can follow along. We pulled this off of National Journal, and it's an amalgamation of things from his transition website. I think you're going to be hearing more and more about the government budget fight and spending priorities, but you're also going to be hearing about tax plans and where revenues stand, and of course that'll go hand in hand with the budget discussion. And then the work of fulfilling some of his campaign promises about the Affordable Care Act changes and financial services reform. And with that, I'll kick it over to you, Melanie. Or, I'm sorry, Diz.
No problem. So one of the kind of bigger areas of discussion recently since the election, especially for government contractors and grant recipients, are what to make of some of the immediate steps that the administration might take. He's made comments, Mr. Trump or President-elect Trump has made comments about canceling illegal, overreaching, and kind of job-killing type government regulation in order to get businesses going and get people employed. So, there's been a lot of discussion about some of Obama's executive orders over the past couple years, and a few of them have been pretty controversial for federal grant and contract recipients, particularly on the contracting side. There's three that have been pretty controversial, pretty widely discussed. They don't apply to grant recipients, so this is more just information for you if you do have federal contracts. But those three, and we do anticipate these three being on the chopping block. However, there's some things to consider about these that may or may not impact kind of your assessment of them. The first one is the paid sick leave executive order. The interesting thing about the paid sick leave is actually while the executive order is on the books, the way it's written, it actually doesn't do anything until the FAR Council issues regulations implementing it. Well, the FAR Council hasn't done that. And to Kara's point earlier, if a final rule happens to come out, at the 11th hour, there's a very good chance that can be pulled back. So,
and let me just clarify one second, because I think it's an important point. The regulation would not go into effect until it was actually published in the Federal Register. So that's an important point just for the purposes of timing. If OMB has some regulations that it wants to get out, it's going to have to choose which ones it wants to put forward because there may not be enough time to publish all of them.
Right.
It's a physical publish date that makes it go into effect.
Right, absolutely. And
and all of those dates clearly, if they haven't been published yet, are going to be after that May 30, 31st deadline. So they're all going to be subject to the CRA. And so the paid sick leave one, while it's on the books and it's a valid executive order at this time, it actually has no practical impact at this time, and we likely think it will be rescinded. But I also don't anticipate any FAR rules coming out that would stick. The second one is the fair pay and safe workplaces. This one requires disclosures of labor violations and has created quite a stir as well. This one's actually been challenged in court and is currently on hold. It's been stayed in district court. It remains to be seen how the federal government will handle that case should it still be on hold when the Trump administration comes forward. So we'll have to keep an eye on how the Department of Justice wants to handle that as that case continues. And then the last one is the minimum wage. This one might be the most important for all of you who have federal contracts, because this one actually does not require a FAR regulation. So this executive order goes in place as of January 1, 2017, which, as everyone knows, is before Inauguration Day. So it goes in effect while the Obama administration is still in place. So most contractors have been moving forward to prepare themselves for this regulation, or the impact of this executive order. It only applies to contracts issued after that time period, so it shouldn't be retroactive to any previous contracts that you have. But you do need to keep an eye on that one. But again, I would anticipate that this would be one that would be on the chopping block when the administration takes over.
It's probably worth sharing that it's not uncommon in an administration change like we're having from one party to another one, that these executive orders would be revoked at the stroke of a pen on January 21st, and they would be done en masse. This is a little bit different than what could happen with the Congressional Review Act and the regulations, which would require 10 hours of debate before the vote could be taken in Congress, and then, of course, anything could happen on the floor. So there's a certain limited number of regulations that would be ripe or sort of targeted for the Congressional Review Act revocation based on current rules, but the executive orders can happen seamlessly and, of course, without Congress or delay.
And without rulemaking, I should add, too. So executive orders, to Carl's point, is it just takes a stroke of a pen. It doesn't require notice and comment and the whole rulemaking process. That's why they're, A, easy to implement, and B, easy to rescind.
Can I ask for a point of clarification, though? Cara, if he cannot rescind an executive order if the rule has already been put in place, right? If there's an actual agency regulation in place, which is why the published date is so important. If there's an actual regulation in place, that's an agency action that would require further comment period, further development by the agency, although he could issue an executive order that directed the agency to make those changes.
Sure. So we're thinking about in the example of an executive order directing rulemaking. Mm-hmm. So the executive order would kind of almost sunset in its authority once the regulations are made effective. So even its revocation would not have an impact on the downstream, or I would say upstream, the hierarchy of the regulation.
Two that I think, and Cara made a point about an en masse executive order rescinding all of President Obama's executive orders. There's been some debate of whether he'll do such an en masse executive order, or whether he'll do a kind of targeted individual rescindment of each executive order. Clearly, the en masse is much easier to do, just one executive order wiping out all the executive orders. But he may not be inclined to wipe them all out. He's shown some interest in some of Obama's initiatives and things. So it remains to be seen whether it'll be en masse or not. The two executive orders I list here, if he does do kind of a more strategic rescindment, I think these two may survive, partly because the first one, dealing with human trafficking, a large part of that is statutory. I mean, the executive order has some nice nuances and bells and whistles to it, but the primary guts of what's required there is statutory based, and that's not going to get wiped out with an executive order. So the large bucket of requirements aren't going to go anywhere. And then the second one I'm doing this in reverse. The first one dealing with discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity. I mean, he recently made a comment that he believes that's a well-settled law with respect to marriage. So one might think that he's inclined to keep that on the books. So we'll just have to see kind of how he deals with that. To kind of reiterate the CRA issue, again, if there are regulations on the book, particularly with paid sick leave, if that gets on the books before the Obama administration leaves the White House, then that could be subject to the CRA, but the recipient of the executive order itself wouldn't have any weight because the regulations would be on the books.
Can I?
Absolutely. No, please.
Yeah, just wait for the mic.
So do you guys know who? Oh, sorry. Do you know who is actually doing the review of these executive orders and potential regulations that fall into this vulnerable CRA period?
So no, I don't know the actual names of the folks. I couldn't, but here's where it's coming from. It's the people inside the transition team, but it's the landing teams that'll be looking at the executive regulations. Right. Or I'm sorry, the regulations. The executive orders are probably being dealt with as a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, so you don't know whether those are under review right now by the team?
Right, and one thing actually, Cara, I don't believe he's indicated who he might appoint to OMB, and that could be a key. OMB and OFPP could be key positions that he staffs, but he may not staff those until later in the spring. He may not. I don't know when he'll get around to selecting those positions. The
OMB would be something that I think we're going to hear about before Christmas, and the names that are floating around there are Mr. Cohen from Goldman Sachs is sort of a front runner as of this afternoon.
I want to take just a few quick minutes to talk a little bit about compliance in general. And it's really difficult right now to know what's going to happen with any given rule. There's President-elect Trump has certainly indicated that he would like to do away with some regulations, and I think that we'll see that. It's important, though, to keep in mind a couple of things. One, states may be regulating some of these areas as strongly as ever, and so to the extent that you're subject to multiple jurisdictions, you want to keep all of your state regulations in mind. And then two, we see the pendulum in regulation sort of swings back and forth all the time. We saw this in the Iraq contracts that were issued. It was all pro-private sector, pushing sort of in what had been thought of to be inherently governmental functions into private contracts. And then later, in a different administration, those contracts were reviewed and were critiqued by the Department of Justice, by the OIGs that were put in place by a different administration. I say this not to sort of take a position on whether or not the regulations are good or should be put in place. I mean, I think many of us would like to see some deregulation, but only as a cautionary warning that we should take all of these things in stride. You need to have a good compliance program in place. You need to have sort of a measured view towards compliance, only because we don't know what's going to happen day to day with this administration, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next administration. So even compliance, measured approach is certainly the way to go in any compliance plan.
Okay, so there we go. And Cara touched on this a little bit. So what do we? The focus here is for grant recipients to start thinking about the next administration and how that might affect their programming, how it might affect individual programs or their programming overall. I mean, the main theme, I think, and the primary takeaway for everyone, I think, today should be open-minded, be flexible, and be creative. Think about opportunities with other agencies and other organizations to keep yourself going and to be creative in terms of how you keep the programs going. We are going to see, it looks like, cuts to certain agencies, Department of Education, EPA, maybe HUD, maybe HHS, which are large funders of federal grants. But we are going to probably see increases in other organizations like Department of Defense, NASA, DHS. They may all see increases in their budgets. I think it's going to be critical for nonprofits to look at what they're doing and to think about how they can be more creative in where they get the funds to supplement what they're doing. Education, for instance. So you may be relying a lot on grants from Department of Education, but what's to say that DoD can't fund some of those programs? Maybe those programs can be geared towards veterans. You know, the Veterans Administration might see more funding. So one of the things we really want folks to think about as this transition takes place is that, look, your programs are critical to your organization's viability. Don't, you know, crawl under a rock and think that all is bad, because I think there's opportunity. And it's just a matter of being creative and thinking kind of with kind of outside the box. Where are some other places that we can do some of this? To Melanie's point, I do think that there's going to be an importance on enforcement still. Waste, fraud, and abuse is hands down a bipartisan issue. No one likes federal monies being wasted or abused or the government being defrauded. So I don't think we're going to see a whole cardinal, you know, a tide in enforcement actions. And so it's important to have that robust compliance program, even though you might think the Trump administration is going to be more business friendly. Trust me, I mean, the Republicans on Capitol Hill are just as tough on contractors as the Democrats are, and in many cases, much tougher. You know, every year we hear about potential legislation, suspension, debarment, and waste, fraud, and abuse measures to be taken against government contractors and grant recipients. And I don't think that's going to let up. I think IGs are still going to be, you know, doing their thing, looking under every rock. And so I think it's critical that it's not an opportunity to let up on compliance, but it's just an opportunity to think about other ways to fund your program.
And just to that point, we were talking a little bit about this before the presentation. You know, the pendulum for IGs or active IGs and compliance really started swinging under the Obama administration, kind of a closer look at what you're doing with the funds, and really not tolerating what they would see as waste, fraud, or abuse. The first place that you really started to see that was maybe with the Recovery Act funds and the RAT board. I don't see that letting up under a Republican administration. I think that insight and that sort of pickiness, to use Melanie's word, isn't necessarily going to ease up, but I think the consequences become more severe for the programs. If they can find fraud, waste, and abuse, an aggressive IG could be able to make the case for the program to be defunded. So it's be careful, watch out, because it's also easy to defund a program if you're looking at a bottom line number that your agency needs to hit in order to achieve the administration's goal for a deficit.
Now, we're going to dive into some discussion on, you know, thinking outside the box and opportunities. But before we do, one of the challenges I think we are going to have is this freeze on the hiring of government employees. Cara mentioned it as a cost-saving measure for the federal government, and certainly it will save money for the federal government. But any of you that deal with the government on a day-to-day basis, as we do, it's often very difficult to get your contracting or your grants officer on the phone in a short amount of time. And if we're talking about freezing hiring within those levels in the government, then you're talking about them being responsible for more programs, being more responsible for more contracts, and they're likely being unavailable more often, which is hard to imagine because it's sometimes hard to find their availability as it is. It also, you know, likely, as we did during sequestration a couple years ago, to see lower morale actually impact the work. And so these are going to be challenges that we may be facing, and I think it's one of those things. There's probably not a lot we can do about it, but it's good to at least know that that's a challenge going in, because certainly it's going to impact timing, and knowing that it's going to take a long time or potentially a long time to get any certain action. You know, it's not a time to wait. You don't want to just wait until the last minute to do something. You want to really start sowing the seeds, and all the more reason why to keep that good relationship with your grants or contracting officer throughout the life of your program or your contract, because if you do ever need them, you don't want to wait a month to get in touch with them.
I'll just jump in here too. It's probably interesting to harken back to when we talked about hiring 4,000 people. When you even think about the logistics of putting out a notice of funding availability, there's got to be someone in that building to sign it. And in these sorts of transition moments, there can be just a lack of authority for someone to sign that in order for it to be published. So it wouldn't be uncommon for there to be a slight delay in the regular process for actually obtaining your funding as well.
Well, so now that we talked about all of the grandness of uncertainty, and we reaffirmed everything that you've probably heard on every news station in the last month, let's spend some time discussing a little bit about what you can and should be doing between now and January 20th. And because I think this is really important. If you're here, if you're on the phone, if you're listening to this program, you are in some way responsible for the legal rights or the compliance of your organization. And I think it is so important for everybody that is in this room, that is on the phone, all the people that are part of that charge, to understand what it is your agreements say. That's step one. Know the terms of your agreement. You know, if there's going to be defunding, there may be some, you know, terminations coming down the pipe. Are you going to be, what is required for termination? What kind of notice period is required for termination? What is required to say that you terminated for cause? Is there going to be any reason for somebody to terminate you? How would that what would that process look like? We talked a little bit about delays. What is the wind-up period required for terminated funding? How much funding, how much sort of leeway would you get if they said to you, you know, in February, we're very sorry, we don't want to fund your program anymore. Because this is so important to understand these things going into sort of a climate change, because we need to be able to pivot. We need to move to additional federal funding. We need to find new partners. We need to think about ways that we can privatize some of the things we're doing. And it takes work, but it takes, the first step is sort of knowledge, right? Like, where are we currently getting our funds from, and what are the rights under those things? You want to pay close attention to the certification across all of your agreements and your donors. So if you were to, for example, be terminated for cause for some reason, you know, of course it would be unjust. All of my clients do everything perfectly, but you know, say there was a reason where the government said, you know, we're going to terminate you for cause. That might need to be reported to all of your donors, all of your funding, public or private. And so it's so important to understand sort of the lay of the land, what rights would be triggered across the board, both on a public funding and private funding sector. You also want to ensure, and this sort of goes towards what we've been talking about, you do not receive any bad past performance ratings. There is no time like the present to have a beautiful compliance program put in place, to remind everybody that they need to be operating with integrity, with honesty, with dotting every I, crossing every T, because the last thing we need in an administration that is looking at you know, debt as a priority and reducing that debt is to give them a reason not to use us, not to use our program, not to pick our program for future funding. And the reason it's very important is it could impact you not just today, but you know, that sort of decision would go onto SAM, and it would be required by every grants agreement officer, every contracting officer for the next several years to be reviewed. So again, it's very, very important at this time. We want to know what we're supposed to be doing under our federal funds, federal funding agreements. We want to do those things. We want to submit the reports. We want to ensure that all of our certifications are correct. And then we want to know what happens if we need to break up. I mean, what's sort of the prenup, right? Like that in our relationship with the government, because those are going to be understanding and being able to move quickly is, I think, going to make a difference for a number of organizations.
Let me just add, kind of emphasizing a point Cara made earlier, which is, and I'm using an analogy. Think of the government as a bear, and they have control of your program, right? they don't want to lose the program, so they don't want the program to look bad. Well, when you're being chased by a bear, you don't have to run faster than the bear. You have to run faster than the other guy running from the bear, right? So be better than everyone else who's performing the program. You don't want to be the one that causes them to say, you know what, we're going to T4C you because you're giving us a bad rap and this whole program's at risk. Be better than the other folks that are working that program. That way you're not the reason, either that the program gets defunded or that, they're cutting you off in order to, their view is to cut you off to save the program. So to Melanie's point exactly, which is beef up your compliance. That's not always a cheap thing, but make sure you're doing things correctly. If there's any doubt, get it fixed. Don't be the one that causes the program to either be on the chopping block or for you to be on the chopping block. Really present yourself as best as you possibly can. I think best foot forward at this time is a good idea.
The other thing you want to do is talk to your agency. Talk to them early. Start thinking about a number of things. I think first you want to put together think about why your organization is just the greatest organization the federal government has ever given money to. I'm sure there are some of you out there, right? Think about why your program is essential, what it is that you bring to any administration, what it is, how many people you hire, how you're leveraging the federal funds that the government has given you and using them so wisely. Don't wait until someone asks you the question to answer it for yourself. Really put pen to paper and think, how am I going to sell myself to a new administration with perhaps different priorities? And how am I going to sell myself to other potential funding partners? And how am I going to sell myself to somebody that may have a large DoD grant and I could do a small little piece of it even though I've been getting funds from a different agency? How do you fit into a sort of a new set of circumstances and players? I think it's also important to talk to your agency about reducing costs by narrowing how you can narrow the scope or substitute in or out personnel. Say you have key personnel that are very, very expensive, but really you could probably do the same thing with someone less expensive. Consider having those conversations with your agency where you're able to keep the mission, sort of what the critical mission of your program is, but maybe in a more cost-effective way. Think about whether you need to transfer funds from a nice-to-have part of your scope of work to another critical needs part of scope of work. I mean, I wouldn't wait until everybody's sort of scrambling to figure out this new world order to sort of sit down and really think, what are the things that are so important to our program, that are important to the agencies that we serve, that are important to that bottom line that Cara's talked about, the government can't do without and we can't do without. Consider whether or not you can reduce matching requirements. Sometimes we go in and initially we say, okay, we're going to provide 30% of the funds through private donations for this particular program. If you can do without the match, approach the agency and say, can we modify this agreement where we could use our matching funds on the things that are meeting other critical needs that are still within the spirit of the program, but that maybe are not within the scope of this particular grant agreement. Sort of think through all of those different things, and the reason that you want to think through them today and not in 2017 is that for some of these changes, they require prior approval from the federal awarding agency. So if you're going to modify the scope, or if you're going to change out key personnel or make changes to cost share or matching, all of that requires under 200.308 for you to get prior written approval from the agency. Before they get a million things to do because they have a new administration and they're thinking through how to change their regulations, or they have a million requests, or their hiring freeze goes into effect, like all of these things that are going to sort of slow down the administrative process. Get out in front of some of these things and start engaging your agency in a dialogue, bringing some solutions to them about how you can best utilize the funds that you currently have.
Yeah, on matching, it's interesting because I think it can go both ways. I absolutely agree with Melanie. Repurposing what you had been using as a matching funds for some other purpose, critical purpose of the organization would be great. Alternatively, though, depending on the circumstances, the agency might want more matching. They may say, look, we love this program. We just can't fund this much. Can you bring 50% to the table and we'll get a 100% program, but for 50% of the cost? Selling things like that to the government as well will give them value. They're getting a 100% program for 50% of the cost. That's a value to the government. So think about matching as both a shield and a sword. You can use it both ways. So be creative in that way. The other thing is a lot of nonprofits don't leverage their IP. And think about your IP. Look at your IP. Now, some of that IP, if it's developed at government expense, the government has certain rights to it, but that doesn't mean that the world has certain rights to it. The copyrights that you have, that stuff's that's usually a valuable commodity that organizations have, but maybe aren't leveraging as much as they could or should. And so start thinking about other revenue streams like your IP, where you might be able to get additional funds in through those mechanisms.
And then another interesting area that I just want all of our clients to consider, and I have no idea how this will ultimately play out, but think about program income and engage your agency in a conversation about program income. Let's talk a little bit first about what program income is and what we mean. Program income is basically anything that, it's written so broadly, it's any time you generate funds out of the money that the federal government gave you. I mean, that's a very loose definition. There's a more detailed technical definition for program income, and it depends on what your grant agreement says and sort of what regulations apply to you. But I guess step one is you want to understand what it means to be program income under your grant. But think about program income. Ordinarily, under most grant agreements, the default rule, in the uniform guidance right now is that any time you generate program income, so any time you get federal investment of dollars and then you get, somebody pays you a fee for using the facility that you've funded with federal funds, that fee then has to go back to the federal government in the sense that it reduces the amount of allowable costs that you can charge to the federal government. So usually the program income is used to offset, in a sense, the amount of allowable funds. There are, however, two alternatives to program income use, but they require prior written approval by the awarding agency. You can, if you get this prior approval, use program income in addition to your federal funding, as long as it's within the scope of work. So in that program income definition or treatment, you would get to keep the fee that you got off of your building, and you would use that fee to something else, to another allowable cost within scope. Another thing that you could do is use program income to offset your cost-sharing matching obligations. And then again, that would free up program income, or free up what you were spending on the cost-sharing and the matching for other costs that maybe are unallowable, or other programs that you're trying to fund, other infrastructure. So give some thought to a couple of things. One, are there investments that you're already making that you're generating program income from? Or two, are there investments you could be making? Are there things that you haven't maybe ever really thought about because the money would just go back to the federal government anyway, or reduce your overall cost, but investments that you actually could make that would generate fees, that would generate some sort of revenue that could be used to fund your program if you had the right agreement in place. I think in this new world that we're entering, if there is an emphasis on privatization, this type of thinking seems in line with that goal, with that end goal, to continue the growth of the programs that we're doing, but in a way that's a little more self-sustaining and that looks towards our own investment from the funds that we've gotten. And so think through those issues. One thing that you do want to do if you were to approach the agency about how to handle program income, though, is that you want to clarify the scope and the terms of your agreement to allow for the program income to be used. Say you have a sort of a general mission, and then you have a funding stream that has a certain scope of work, but you're thinking, well, this would be this other program, this other objective would be within scope if we were to modify our scope of work just a little bit. So think through those kinds of issues and approaching your agency in a way that is creative in expanding the pie.
Yeah, I can't emphasize enough Melanie's point about thinking of ways to generate program income. A lot of organizations that we deal with, they don't want to generate program income because it's just another hassle, right? You got to track it, you got to maintain records on it and figure out where it's going and making sure you're reducing the allowable expense under the grant. But it is just as critical to that concept of matching that you can sell to the agency, look, you invest X dollars, we're going to either get matching funds of Y to help support the program, or your X dollars we're going to turn into X times 3 and be able to run this program, to essentially somewhat privatize these programs. And so the government's going to get this program at a cost benefit to them. So it's critical to, I think, analyze where you can start picking up program income. And then, we'll talk now about what you can do maybe with the agency on negotiating how that program income's handled. So I'll let you go.
Yeah, the other thing you want to be sure, though, is that you have an understanding with the agency in place before you run off and make all this money for the federal government and decrease the pot for yourself, is you have an understanding of how that program income would be treated not only during the period of performance but also after the period of performance. So, in the event there was defunding, there was a termination of some type, what would happen to the program income after the period of performance, after there's an accelerated termination? In theory, the federal government's investment in that program income might stand. They might require you to continue to give back the federal portion for the next 3 years or so. But if you go into it with an understanding the agency, this program income is our program income going forward after termination, and you have that agreement before you come to your parting of ways with the federal government, then you can go forward with that income generation, and it's entirely your own organization that helps you to become self-sustaining. We're seeing that as a trend, really, in some areas that have historically been funded heavily, but as budget priorities shift, they've had to sort of get a little bit more creative about how they're going to be self-sustaining. And I think that this is a time that is a good opportunity for everybody to speak to their agencies about whether, how they can sort of navigate becoming a little more self-sustaining.
I think at this point we wanted to reserve time for questions about any specific issues or anything we have or have not discussed. We're happy to take questions both in the audience or online. Just let Camille pass the mic to you if you have questions.
Anybody have any questions for any of our speakers? We have a question from one of the webinar participants, and I think it's for Kara. Could you give a forecast of how the FY 2017 appropriation process is going to work? What happens to awards that are in continuation periods in FY 17? If decisions on FY 17 are not made until March of next year, won't awardees already be halfway through their FY 17 period on the continuing resolution? Could they be cut midstream?
Could they be cut midstream? Gosh, without knowing more about what programs we might be talking about, this is a difficult question to answer. But once funds have been appropriated, they're considered spent as soon as they go into the agency. So if Congress has already decided that this is a number, the award agreement signed, like, no, you're not going to lose the funding there. But what I think what the question's getting at is, can I reliably renew, or can I reliably apply for the next FY? And the question is, when will that budget be available? And I talked a little bit about it in my presentation. We'd hoped in regular course it would kind of be, the budget would be set, finalized, and voted on by the House by June. But I anticipate that it's going to take more time for this budget year than it has. Well, I'm looking back at the last series of continuing resolutions. We've been operating without a real budget for a while. So I'll say this: stay tuned and and watch those NOFAs. Yeah.
On that note, I want to thank our panelists for a terrific presentation today. Thanks to all of you for participating, and we hope to see you back here next month in about a couple weeks for our next program. Thank you very much, and stick around for some bubbles.